within the work that we do around understanding racism and anti-racist practice, one of the things I always talk about, within our work is that, we as a society need to move beyond unconscious bias. And when we have these kind of intimate conversations, I always say that, when we enter into the discussion about race within society, we all enter at different levels. And I guess the work that we do is always try to get people to kind of think about the kind of context in which we're living in, but also to get people to be aware of some of those kind of, unconscious, those covert situations and things that may happen within our society, specifically for people of colour, black people specifically, and what the ripple effect of that consequence ultimately may be. So one of the things I always talk about is, white privilege. And I know that white privilege sometimes is one of those terms that, people feel quite uncomfortable with. And it's interesting because I remember speaking to a colleague, many months ago, and she said, Craig, I feel really uncomfortable with the term white privilege, because it kind of seems like or feels like, black people are ultimately, pointing the finger and saying all white people are guilty for the kind of systemic issues that exist within society. And I think it's an interesting point, and I believe that's also part of the discussion that I say in regards to having those kind of uncomfortable conversations with the other. And my understanding of that conversation, and I kind of expressed to her, is that when we're talking about the notion of white privilege, we have to look at things within a historical context, because history, I always say, is the best teacher to give us a better understanding of today. Now, we know that from a historical context, that when we think about racism, it started with science and the notion of scientific racism and what that meant, where we're talking about individuals, Europeans in particular, that went around the world and utilized science in order to create this kind of inferior, superior mindset in order to justify the behavior between one group of people to another. And we're talking about dominance, we're talking about imperialism, we're talking about, slavery, colonialism, and where that scientific racism has kind of almost emerged, from different parts of history, and how that's been utilized to target particular groups. But then when we think about that in a wider context, and we think about, the impact of things like slavery and colonialism, we're talking about over 500 years where millions of people were taken from the African continent and placed in different parts of the world to work for free. And with that rape, with that kidnap, with that stripping of culture, belief systems, and the strongest of individuals were taken from a particular place, those individuals were used in order to work for free that accumulated a particular wealth. And that particular wealth that was made or given on the basis of that free servitude was used to build Western civilizations. And on the back of the civilizations that were created and built on the backs of individuals that were from particular communities, from particular environments, African continent in particular, that wealth was ultimately accumulated. And that may link us to a different discussion that's been taking place, I would say probably the last 12 months, where you may notice that there's been loads of students and people from different parts of the UK and America pulling down statues. And people are like, why are people pulling down statues? Because what's now happening is that people are doing the history. As I've said previously, history sometimes is the best teacher. And what we've realized is that a lot of individuals, wherever they may be, throughout Europe, for example, had a hand in slavery. So whilst those figures are being revered for the amazing things that they did in particular cities and the wealth that they brought to the cities and the opportunities that they used within those particular spaces, people are saying despite that, they also had a hand in slavery where that wealth was used in order to do that. And I remember a student once saying in a conversation that you would never go to Germany and you would never see, statues and figurines of Adolf Hitler being planted around Germany just because of what Hitler ultimately done, because of the adverse impact of what had happened with the Jewish community. And in the same way, when we're looking at places in the UK, particular cities like Bristol, Birmingham, London, you've got particular figurines that are being put out there that people are now saying, wait, the historical context of these individuals, it wasn't just good. And why is that important when we're talking about the concept of white privilege? Because what we're understanding and acknowledging is that that system that has ultimately been built off wealth, that's created those particular opportunities, by default benefits white people. But that doesn't also mean that it's financial. That doesn't mean that white people are given things or they're given some sort of a handout. So when we look at then statistics within education, when we look at statistics within criminal justice, when we look at statistics within mental health and other aspects, we start to see what is called a disparity. We start to see disproportionate numbers of particular groups in society that are mistreated compared to any other counterpart or any other group. And that kind of tells the wider story of that kind of intergenerational historic nature of racism. So when we're talking about moving beyond unconscious bias, it's about having that conversation about, well, what does privilege mean? And I remember using a kind of example of, me and my friend that when we first grew up in our particular community, came from the same environment, came from the same street. He was Irish, I came from a Caribbean community. Well, as we started to get older, I realized that there was things that were fundamentally different. When we went to school, he was treated completely different to the way I was treated in school. I remember going home and I remember getting stopped and searched, and he would stand and observe me getting stopped and searched. As we started to get older, he was bestowed particular opportunities. And we can say, well, these are all isolated scenarios and situations, but those particular experiences of when I was growing up with my white friend, these things ultimately show kind of the wider conversation about that disproportionality. So when we're talking about the concept of white privilege, is that not necessarily that white people benefit from the system financially, but also on the basis of being white. And when we're talking about white privilege in the concept that, me as a black male, I don't have the privilege to not worry about race. I don't have the privilege to, navigate my life and in a society where I know that I'm being thought about, I'm being spoken about from the context solely on the color of my skin. So despite the fact that I have 5 degrees, despite the fact that I'm a national speaker, despite the fact that, I've done so many things and had accolades for so many things that I've done within the UK, I can step outside my house and be strangled by a police officer and die. I can still go to the shop and be stopped and searched 7 to 8 times more likely than any other counterpart. And I think when we have these kind of deeper conversations about privilege and what that means within our society, it's not just as black and white and just thinking that people are given something. We're talking about a system that benefits and is designed to protect and also to serve white people, and whether that is conscious or unconscious. And I think these are the conversations that I think are really important when we have those wider conversations. So when we do a lot of work with organizations nationally about understanding racism and anti-racist practice, how do we promote that? How do we get white people to think about and consider the points that I've just made, and those that are willing and understand the idea of humanity, understand the idea of fairness, equality, and equity? How do those individuals then become allies to then promote this idea and this notion of anti-oppressive practice? How do we get people to think about, microaggressions? How do we get individuals to think about all of the things that I've just mentioned in context? And that's when we talk about pushing the conversation beyond just equality and diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias into anti-racist practice.